want to talk about the real problems and challenges that this technology, the way it manifests itself in the business. And all the speakers that you're going to hear in the exec track, we've talked about, let's get real. Like, let's get real with what the problems are. Let's get real with how we fix them. And I tried to bring people to the table who have a lot of real world experience so that we're not talking in theory about this stuff. And again, so no question is off limits. When we start into the Q&A, it would be great if you guys could provide feedback for that. I'm generally plenty loud, so we'll pass the mic between our guests here, which we're super glad to have for the event. We got Vincent and John, and Vince is from Accenture. They'll tell us a little bit about their background. So this will get us kicked off, and then we'll take it from there. So be thinking about your questions as we go forward. So good starting point. Who's got the mic first? John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do at Dell?
Sure. So I'm John Whittaker. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and the Market Evangelist for the Information Management Group at Dell Software. So I own and I'm responsible for products related to database development, database administration, business intelligence, big data analytics, as well as our sort of integration platform as a services oriented products like Boomi. So if you're familiar with the Toad products, that's probably what we're most well known for. If you use Toad in your past, and certainly if you came out of the relational database world, you probably did. Those products now reside in Quest, or previously resided in Quest and now reside in Dell post the acquisition. My background, I've been a tech guy for about 20 years. Was a CTO of a high-flying e-commerce company in the 90s when that was a cool thing to do. I've been involved in everything from security to software development. Now I run marketing at a large technology company.
Great, thanks.
What did you call me, Mumbles?
Mumbles. I told Mumbles he's got to speak up. He tends to get into mumble mode. So
if
you can't hear him in the back, somebody throw something.
I'm a low talker, so I apologize. My background is actually in large-scale data and analytics, starting back in the 90s. And what's interesting to me about this whole topic is that back in the 90s, I was talking to my clients about technologies that they found very strange, and they would yell at me for talking to them about it. And the technology in particular was MPP platforms and Teradata, and they really didn't like talking about those things. Fast forward where we are today, and Teradata's established database product, and now we have these technologies that are viewed as odd or different. So this has been a very fun activity for me to be involved in, because I've been here before. My role at Accenture, we created an organization with Accenture, within Accenture, that's built around deep technologists. So they're not the traditional consulting guys that you would think of. They're deep technologists, and I run euphemistically what is called the global big data practice, but we are a domain that is built around solving problems in the data space, and it's in our emerging technology innovation organization.
So just hold the mic for a second.
Sure.
So what we're going to talk about today are some of the decisions that we've seen collectively that have truly crippled what are otherwise amazing initiatives inside of companies. And Vince actually has a saying that I think is very apropos, and he says, guys, the technology isn't the problem, the people is the problem. And that is manifesting itself, I got to tell you, in very real ways in really big accounts. And that's mistakes we don't want to see you guys make. So a good starting point, I think, is let's talk about some of the characterizations, fair or not, of the two groups that seem to be at odds in sometimes in this poor decision making, which is lines of business and IT proper. So Vince, let's start with you and talk about some characterizations of IT. What are some of the negative stereotypes in an organization when they hear the word the IT department to a business? What are some of the negative connotations that might come to mind?
So I actually think there are two groups within IT. There are actually three groups that seem to be not talking at the same level. And within technology, there seem to be two parties. There are the traditional technologists, so maybe the traditional relational database guys, and then the non-traditional guys using things like Cassandra. And if I were to say the negative characterization that I hear most often, looking at it from the business feedback that we get, it's that they don't understand my needs, they're not responsive. I've not been able to get this data problem solved for the last 10 years. Why is this new technology going to solve it for me all of a sudden? So I think that there's a misperception that the technologists are not responsive. And I think at the end of the day, really what the challenge is that the two groups aren't speaking the same language. That's primarily what I see.
So switching gears, let's flip it to the other side of the house and talk about characterizations maybe that IT has of the line of business that are negative, that sometimes can lead to bad decisions down the road.
Sure. So from my experience, line of business where I live tends to be blamed for, spinning up projects or through our own internal shadow IT departments building solutions that don't operate at scale or aren't being designed from a long-term management perspective. We're really great at spinning those sort of projects up and jumping in and getting on the cutting edge. But as soon as we've sort of had our needs met, we're kind of done with it. We're not generally that interested in the ongoing management or what it looks like at scale. And rightfully or wrongfully, that's where a lot of frustration and friction points sort of come into play. And we certainly see a great deal of friction and the chasm that exists between line of business and where we want to go and what we want to see happen and what IT typically provides, because you have a pretty serious cognitive dissonance between what we want to achieve and the needs and realities that IT wants to support around governance, around ability to scale, around ability to manage and what have you. So that's where I would say the differences are.
So Vince, you've been doing this a long time, like you said earlier, and unfortunately what you guys just described, when I was developing in the early 90s, I was a line of business developer. Back then, we would have called ourselves shadow IT. I'm not sure that there is such a thing anymore. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's amazing how many issues arise from non-technical problems. And full disclosure, Vince and I have done some pretty big implementations together already with DataStax and Accenture. And the big data problem seems to be the thing where everybody's saying, oh, it's the big data that's causing these contention points. Is this a new movie, or are we just seeing the same movie played out again with a new technology? I'm trying to figure out, is the big data new technology is what's causing the friction now, or is it a new level of friction, or is it really no different than it's always been?
I think it's the same movie, but there are a couple of differences. So why is it the same movie? The same movie, I'm very surprised how many times I run into multiple organizations within the enterprise that are competing with each other to do something. And that's very disruptive. You have a hard time getting things done. And so it's very much not about the technology. No one steps back and says, instead of looking at the feature functions of a product, no one says, what's our strategic objective? What problem are we trying to solve? Hey, people who support me, how do we go solve that problem? And I think that's the way it's been for a while. What makes the big data technology space a little bit different is that there are people, right now what I'm running into is the education level or experience level in a deep way with some of these technologies, and that actually creates some problems that I haven't really seen before. And I think that knowledge and experience is causing some of those problems with these new technologies. Now, I think that that's going to go away as more people understand how to use these things and use them in production. But generally, it's the same movie with a few different twists.
So, John, one difference I see in this world, coming from my relational background for 20 years, the businesses seem to be moving so much faster now for their own market reasons, right? Like they have to win their own markets, they have to compete, they have to move quick. So from the more kind of like the line of business perspective, maybe, how does this appear to you? Is an accelerated rate of the same thing, or is it a different thing?
Well, I think that there are sort of eerie similarities from today to maybe the last big, massive technology inflection point, which was the big e-commerce movement in the 90s. In that line of business has the sense that they need to get to some end result, and they need to do it now. There's a real urgency around, gaining advantage out of big data analytics, out of being able to leverage this new emerging, opportunity that exists in social data or sensor data or what have you. And in this reality where line of business sort of recognizes this critical need, they're more than willing to fund and push into this space if they get the sense that IT isn't able or is taking too long, or whatever perception they have about IT's ability to meet their needs. And we saw the same thing in the 90s, right? I mean, when I was on the other side of the house, we used to be very frustrated because line of business would go and deploy solutions, and then we'd have to deal with them after the fact. We're seeing the same sort of thing occur. The interesting sort of difference right now is the guide or the sage that existed in the 90s was the webmaster, whereas now the sage is the data scientist. It's the same role, but different terminology.
So let's put some meat on the bone here and talk about a very real problem that has affected, and I just went and looked before we came here, and I have 7 of our accounts that are Fortune 1000 accounts have hit this exact problem I'm about to describe. The project team architects, builds, and starts to prototype their application. They spec out what the hardware requirements are going to be. They send the hardware requirements off to procurement to buy an implementation or a machine implementation. And what they asked for is literally nothing like what showed up. And the project is supposed to go live. Guys, these aren't little side projects I'm talking about. These are very mission critical, visible applications inside these companies. And so one of our architects calls them Tyrannoserver Rex. They bring in these massive servers, right? Because some big data team had a standard that this is the box that you're going to use. Suddenly they try and put that box into production and it screws up because that's not the way it was supposed to be done in Cassandra architecture. So this is where I came up with the title of this track, because guys, it's a stupid decision that's crippling. They've invested in some cases tens of millions of dollars in these projects, and they will screw it all up because of some standard on a piece of paper that somebody didn't see. I have a hard time with that. I mean, I'm really struggling with that. So I'm wondering from your all's perspective, maybe start with you, Vincent. A couple of these maybe we were on together. We don't need to name names, but what is going on with that? That is a level of mind-numbing challenge for me that I do have a hard time getting my head around.
Well, first of all, people don't communicate, and that tends to be a big problem. The other thing is, I think these guys, they do get into their standards, and they're not familiar with web scale implementation. So the concept of being to scale what you have to what is needed at that particular point in time is a little bit of a foreign concept. And then time and time again, what we see is that for the guys that do spec out the lower grade hardware, the commodity stuff, they're not doing enough load and performance testing while they're in test, and so they tend to underbake how much they actually need. And then once it goes into production, then you have, we've had instances of emergency requisitions for, buying a bigger piece or, more commodity stuff, which wasn't in the budget. And then you get the finger pointed. I told you so, you needed to do something better. So I think it does happen. It's because people have standards. They think that's what they need. No one's articulating what web scale means to solve a particular business problem that's being solved. And I think people need better methodologies, if you will, around testing the performance of these things, right? And then projecting out what the impact is going to be.
So you're saying if the implementation team could provide more objective metrics to the buying teams to say, I need this, and by the way, this is why I need this, you're saying perhaps that would solve that miscommunication between, because some of these cases it's almost like hey Vince, hand me that glass of water and you hand me the pepper shaker. I'm like,
right.
Did you not hear me? I mean,
Right.
what is the miscommunication? So that's where it gets tough.
Yeah, because I don't think people have a common language for talking about what kind of performance they need and why. There was a great paper written, I don't know when it was published, was it this year or the end of last year, Cambridge, looking at scale out versus scale up. And they came up with some really interesting findings in their research. And in some cases, scaling up by adding more memory and solid state drives for a class of problems actually was better than trying to scale out. It was more performant and less costly. So what's the point there? The point is they're looking at a class of problems that they need to solve, and they've done some testing and run use cases for that, and then they can make intelligent decisions about what's needed. And I don't see that kind of rigor in the decision-making process. It's usually somebody that says, hey, I think it needs to be about this, and they can articulate what they need in the context of the thing that they're working on, but they don't go further than that, and that's where I think it gets into trouble. So having some type of method or way that you test different business use cases, and what are the implications for how you should scale up or scale out, what are the decision points, I think is something that's necessary to avoid that kind of problem.
So one way to handle that is with this concept of standards. So John, let's talk about standards can be a double-edged sword,
right.
Especially inside of a large organization. So let's start with the concept of, in this big data world, should people have standards teams, or should it be farmed out? Is it too new for that? Do the lines of business need to be creating the standards that get worked on with IT, or does it need to come out of IT? Where do we get this common language?
Well, that's a good question. How do we get from where we're at, where there's this disconnect between what line of business wants to see and do, and the mode of thinking, approaches, and standards that IT has to support. There's a difference that exists, and we're running into these problems. I think the issues you're describing aren't, by and large, because IT wants to undermine what line of business is doing, or anything like that. It's more that the constructs, the vendor relationships, the types of solutions that were agreed upon before just kind of got written in stone, and the person who buys these solutions is different than the person who sort of sets the needs and the requirements of what the solution should do. And you just kind of have this dichotomy. There probably are some percentage of them that are out there that are like, no, I'm a this guy, and we're going to go that way, and I don't care what they say, and they're jamming it down the throat, and vice versa. Line of business sort of would use this as a great example of why they need to have the budget and just go do their own thing, and they'll spend their technology budget that would have gone to IT, they'll just do it themselves. There is that kind of thinking that exists in space, but I think by and large, both organizations want to get along. They want to gain the benefit that each provides. And we're just going through this period where everybody's kind of relearning how to do this, and having more communication, certainly that's always better. But you're going to have a lot of pushback from line of business around that, because there's a great deal of frustration with how long this takes to deploy. And there's very real business consequences to allow a competitor to get into the space earlier, to completely miss the market, and line of business is not going to do it, right? I mean, they'll go out and they'll deploy on their own, and there's a downside to that as well. But you can bypass this problem by doing that. Just be aware that you're going to have products that are not easily managed, that probably don't align to the scale that the business is ultimately going to need in the long term. We're just in this sort of intermediary period where the disconnect is massive. And again, I kind of go back to that need for the guide to help you through this process. Within my organization, we have an individual, Guy Harrison, who's essentially our data scientist. He runs R&D for our group, and real visionary, understands both ends of the spectrum, and he's been incredibly useful. And that's what I believe organizations are going to continue to do for the foreseeable future, until that kind of knowledge creeps into and just becomes part of the tribal knowledge that exists within IT and line of business, and everything gets back to normal.
So we're going to come back to that, because that's actually one of the answers, I think, to how to solve this, is having some go-to guys that are the ones that everybody in the organization needs to trust. And that's a tough thing to find. We're going to talk about how that can work. But before we get there, you say there is a desire to work together between these two conflicting groups. And another real life story. I can't give you too many specifics, so I don't want to give away the company, but one of our customers went into a high velocity period with one of their projects at very large scale, and the project started to run into problems. Turns out the problems were hardware configuration related, as I talked about earlier. And as we did the post-mortem and uncovered what went wrong, and you're expecting to find some software bug or from somebody wrote the wrong specification. I swear to you, the answer was, I hate dealing with that group, and I wasn't going to go to ask them for different servers. Okay, so you took almost an immeasurable hit to your company's reputation and internally because of that. So what are some of the things from a line of business perspective, and then we're going to flip this, what are some of the things that set you off when you're thinking in terms of line of business that you hear from IT departments? And if you're in IT and you really want to make this better, avoid these, right? And if you're in a line of business, chill out a little bit if you hear these things. But because this really is the state of the problem with this dysfunction. So what are some things you hear that, intentional or not, set you off?
Well, I think top of the list is, well, we can't do that, right? I mean, that's we don't use that technology. We've made corporate standards. We're going to go down this path, and that's just not on, right? That would be like saying we're not going to allow port-area web traffic in the 90s because it's a security concern. That's unacceptable position to take. I think as well there's a natural tendency for the IT side to get very technical. They start talking architectures, they start talking, very sort of complex jargon. I come from the technology side, and I run, marketing in a very technical-oriented, for really technical-oriented product line. So personally, it's not that big of a problem, but you can kind of see at customers where we'll go and visit, and the decision maker or the gentleman who has the budget or comes from line of business, their eyes will kind of glaze over as soon as you fall into this, well, this is the reason why the bits and bytes of what we're going to do. You need to keep it at a business level, at a value proposition level. This is what we're going to gain as an organization by utilizing this technology. This is the risk to the organization if we don't do this. And that kind of communication is critically important to gain buy-in from the line of business side, because we don't look at the world through the same lens that IT tends to look at things, and sometimes what may be obvious to IT doesn't make any sense to line of business.
So Vince, you work with both a lot. So flip that around. What are some of the things that you've seen set a project sideways? And again, I can't overemphasize enough, guys. I wish we were talking about little edge cases and little projects, but we're talking about big, mission-critical, multi-million-dollar projects that get set sideways because of this kind of stupidity, right? Of just people inability to work together. So where have you seen projects go sideways when a line of business said something to set off an IT department?
Oh, there's so many. Well, the things that drive me nuts are the mindless attention to standards, right? And you do have problems that require you to think outside the box, right? And so when the business says, no, I can only do it this way, that's very frustrating.
So you're saying the business actually can come back and be rigid about their own things?
Yeah, and if you think about what's driving the point there, TJ touched on a little bit this morning, but it's really the fear of failure. So we've had, and I know the case that you're talking about, there was an estimate to build servers which was like 12,000 hours. It was almost as much as the entire project. And when you have a discussion, why is it this much? And the answer was, well, there was quadruple redundancy built into the estimate just because they wanted to make sure that it would not fail, and we've never solved the problem before. So what drives me nuts about that? There wasn't an honest dialogue about why the estimate was so high. So it's things like that you really have to get over. And at the end of the day, to me, it's not about, again, that's why I say I don't think it's all the technology. It's the people and an inability to have an honest dialogue, and that means a two-way discussion around what am I trying to accomplish, how will this benefit, and when people close that discussion off, that's where you get a lot of, I think that's where you see a lot of disruption entered into the successful project.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and move more toward now. We've been cathartic, got a lot out. We're going to talk about some ways that we've seen it go well, what some things can be that we can do to be better. But before we do, any general questions around the topic so far? Yeah.
Perhaps really more of a comment. It sounds like that a lot of these issues, it's not dependent on the new big data technologies. It happens with any technology decision or any big project decision, and I really think it comes down to people. There's a good book, The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni, that talks about healthy organizations, and it's exactly what you guys are talking about here, is that there are a bunch of unhealthy organizations and they're making decisions poorly because they refuse to communicate properly.
So the essence of the comment for those in the back was he's affirming what we said. This doesn't feel like a big data problem. It feels like a company dysfunction problem that's been around a long time. To me, my personal opinion, the manifestation of it is now intensified because it's big data, because the projects are bigger, the visibility is bigger. Quite frankly, the table stakes are bigger, because if you get these projects wrong, and I spent 11 years of my career implementing. We used to write, when I wrote applications, I wrote for departments, and then when I was really big, I was writing for companies. Today, we're writing for countries, and we're writing for the planet. And so when you mess that up, it's big, it's visible, and it's painful. And I think that what happens is the finger pointing, it accelerates because now there's much more on the line. I think you said that earlier. And so now it becomes, well, it's because you chose the wrong technology and you didn't spec out the right hardware. And so I think that big data, because of the enormity of the benefits of the business and or risk, which is what we're going to be talking about in a lot of our other sessions, is a catalyst to make this problem even worse. So I guess the takeaway is, the dysfunction is there, but it can be accelerated. Somebody else had a question right here?
I've seen the same problem in 2 different organizations in the last year. And I think what I've seen, not being an IT person, being more of a developer, is that IT organizations have gotten very good at being predictable over the last 10 years, meaning they've learned how to outsource when needed, they've learned how to minimize risk and control costs. And now you're taking something that's got a lot of unknown variables, you're throwing it to their environment and saying you have to deal with it. And now all of a sudden, their ability to control costs, deal with these risks, is just blowing their picture out of the water. And the change that this requires, it then goes back to communication, right? Let's all get together and agree that we're going to share the risk or whatever it is. But I've seen tremendous resistance to the point where an organization I was in went to Amazon and started spending $12 million a year to get around the dysfunction or perceived dysfunction, just the inability of the organization to absorb this change.
Yeah.
And so this big data problem is so much of a shifting, tectonic shift in the way people have been working. I mean, we're talking MySQL or Oracle. I mean, they knew how to make this thing go. Now you're coming
25 years, right?
Yeah,
we're shattering 25
time.
years worth of paradigms.
People got used to that
Right.
predictability, and now it's changing, and change is hard.
Right.
And it's fast.
Well,
we'll come back to that.
yeah, in my experience, at different times, organizations need different types of people, right? When things are predictable and you're driving operational excellence, it really is around bringing more constraints viewpoint into the business. People who look at the box and go, okay, we can gain more efficiency out of this box by doing this, this, and this. At other times, there's tremendous opportunity at play. There's a chance to break into new markets. There's new technology that can be leveraged to open up all kinds of new ways of doing things. And you need less of the constraint-oriented viewpoint and more of the possibilist. You need more of that look, we could really change the world with this kind of technology, or massively improve the solutions that we have in place today. We can make better decisions, and we know we can by doing this, this, and this. While we're sort of rejiggering our mix to realign, we have a ton of conflict. And the scenario you described, where the organization you were at essentially just said, you know what, we're going to take our ball and we're just going to go home, we're going to play our own game, and IT could just, sit on it, right?
Something, by the way, that has never existed. Right, so this ability to do what you said, this ability to take my toys and go home,
right,
and go host it all on my own and whip out my credit card department and do it on my own, that didn't exist 15 years ago. The best we could do then was I would build a SQL Server system and I'd shove it under the desk,
right,
and hope nobody saw it, till it went down, and then I'd say, oops, IT, you got to go figure this out. But now the impact is way worse, because you can go to Amazon and somebody says spend $12 million.
Absolutely.
It's who's going to get stuck with this problem at the end
Oh,
of the day.
IT. Right, absolutely.
These guys know that.
Absolutely.
And that stuff will
So they're wary, legitimately so.
But they need to engage.
Absolutely. And
It's this lack of engagement that's killing the process.
absolutely. And it's going to become institutionalized if we're not really careful here, right? I mean, if you've been following, where IT spend resides, right now the CMO has about 4 times the budget of the CIO, and they spend between 15 to 20% of that spend currently today on technology buys, right? At the rate of growth of their budget and the shrink of the other budget, by 2017 or so, some analysts have made some reasonable predictions based on the numbers. The CMO will spend more money on IT-related purchases than the CIO does. And, as that happens, there's going to be a lot of interesting problems that emerge if we're not very careful as an organization.
And maybe opportunities.
Absolutely.
So one more comment here from Mark, and then we'll come back in.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something similar, but I would also argue we have actually seen this before. IT at the moment in the last, IT in the 90s became very agile, it was all quick, it was the internet revolution, et cetera, and it's become a process since then and now, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's been a commodity process, and it's been driven by senior executives to be cookie cutter, as you say, outsourced, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think back 30 years, what was the mainframe business?
Right.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Right.
It was processed, it was hard driven, it was the mainframe business when the 90s started is where the IT business is, the IT departments in PCs are today.
Great analogy. Back before I had gray hair, I was the guy breaking those paradigms on the mainframe side. I think that's a very apropos
So
analogy.
I think their problem is they have the same issue, the same mindset. They're now stuck in this low-cost, minimum cost of IT process.
Yeah,
And I would actually argue that it's not all IT's fault.
agreed.
The higher level of the business, the people living in the C-suites of these businesses need to realize, well, hang on a minute, if I'm agreeing to change my business this way, I actually need to resource these guys accordingly.
Right.
They've got to give the CIO the budget to be able and tell him, here's your budget, these things are going on, figure it out.
Yep.
Not figure it out and then have to justify my budget back the other way. Because because as you say, what's happening instead? They're happening anyway, and they're going around it.
So, somebody give him $5. That's a great sequitur from DataStax. My next question, Vince, let's start with you. When we see these go well, and they do, we've had lots of success stories, who are the key executives, kind of by role type, I don't want their names and emails, but who are the key executives in an organization that you see do grease the skids in the right way, do build the right relationships, who has enough clout but isn't so far removed that it's all ethereal to really make this stuff work?
So I don't know if it's a role. I think a lot of it has to do with the culture of the organization, is what I see. So I think I've been in 2 companies in the same industry, and the cultures are different. And in one company, the CIO is able to drive a change agenda and convince the business that it's successful. But that works in that culture. In the other culture, it's not. It's more the adversarial relationship. Go do this. Here, you can only spend this. So I think that it has to do with the culture of the organization. And leadership's willingness to invest in the IT groups to enable them to, to do things in a different way. So
let's stay with you for a second. We've been talking a lot about IT in the business. We hit on earlier the fact that we used to call this thing shadow IT. I want to get both your opinions on this. Is it time to quit talking about shadow IT in the business and IT somewhere else and start truly looking at IT that lives in the business and lives in some centralized standards team? What is the future of IT in this world of cloud and distributed computing and data gravity, where we talk about data living everywhere all over the world? Cassandra, we have customers that have data spread across literally, multiple continents in multiple data centers, different levels of responsibility by different people in the company. What is the future of the IT organization? Do they need to be more involved in business, living in business, working in business, or do they need to stay separate?
I think the culture of the company and the leadership in the company needs to enforce collaboration across the two. And I think that companies are being forced to think beyond what does IT need to do to keep the lights on and balance the checkbook of the applications, right? So I have an application that balances checkbooks. I don't want to mess that up. But it has to be, everybody has to be on the same page around what is the strategic objective, the differentiator that I want to have as a company. There has to be buy-in from both groups, and they have to work together to go make that happen. And so I don't know if IT. So this is the challenge, right? Both groups get caught up in dogma, and there's oftentimes a lack of willingness to meet in the middle. And so where people have to do a better job of this is sometimes you have to go a little bit further and speak the language of your colleague and make that change happen.
When you try that, though, do you see, let's just be honest, do you see the people who try and do that, what's the ratio of them getting shot versus them getting promoted?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. So I'll tell you one.
No, I mean, it's a real question. What do you think it is? It's not on the script. I know I'm off script on you.
No, it's okay. I think that I think it just goes back to the culture of the organization. If you have a culture where failure is not tolerated, you don't invest in innovation, then I think the guy gets shot. If you don't have that, then things seem to work a little bit better, frankly. But I've seen a really interesting thing in IT. I kind of joke about it as the Y2K effect. A lot of the technologists, and young technologists too, they don't want to work in a company that's doing old stuff the old way, right? Because they're looking at it going, wow, these are skills that are not going to grow based on where the market's going. And so when you have that kind of dynamic, it's almost up to the IT leadership to sell the business that this is something you have to do and have to invest in if you value IT as a resource to drive change and keep the lights on, frankly, to do both of those things.
Yeah. I moved out here 2 years ago from Texas. I'm still smarting over that move, but we're here. So one of the things that hit me is so different driving down 101 was Walmart had a billboard. Nothing unusual about that, except the billboard wasn't for their retail consumers. The billboard was for developers. And it said, Walmart does big data. And I thought, now, you don't see that in Texas, I'll give you that. You don't see a billboard from a company advertising talking to developers, but this is a real problem. And you do have to sell that. So
can I go back to one thing?
Yeah.
One thing that does get my goat is there are a lot of really young technologists that I work with, and they're some of the brightest people that I've ever worked with. So whatever the schools are doing to churn out some of these guys, it's impressive. And what really, really frustrates me is when you have guys like me that have gray hair, and they won't listen to the guy because he's too young or he doesn't, quote unquote, have enough experience. And that just really drives me crazy, because what you've done then is you've basically just told somebody they don't know what they're talking about, and they actually do. And the problem isn't them, it's that the person that told them that doesn't think that they have anything valid to say because they don't have experience. I just, that just drives me crazy, you know, and I think.
So John, back to you on your vision of IT. Is there shadow IT? Should there be shadow IT? What's it going to look like?
I don't think it really matters whether you think there should or shouldn't be. There certainly is IT outside of IT, right? I think that the label is outdated. It is so commonplace now and out in the open, and everybody is aware of it. To call it shadow IT is ridiculous. It's IT in the line of business that exists, and line of business has its own data provisioners, it has its own developers, it has its own everything. So, you know, the sooner we sort of put away the, hey, there's something necessarily bad about that, and get on with, well, this is just how the world works, I think we'll be far better off. I would agree with Vince that culturally there are advantages for cultures that have a inherent preference for innovation, as opposed to, particularly in times like these, where you have a lot of technical, you know, upheaval, than the organizations that are operationally efficiency minded, right? You know, at the end of the day, you really want to run a company that has both, right? You want to run a well-run, efficient, you know, operationally excellent organization that has terrific innovative capability, right? And that's what you want. But, you know, the CFO that you hire at an organization at Walmart is probably very different than the CFO you would hire at an organization like Google, right? One is all about creating a price point and driving down, you know, cost for a consumer that, you know, predominantly is living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, it's getting it razor thin for that consumer base, and having that constraints-oriented viewpoint, at least within the operations organization, is absolutely critical. You won't be able to compete. Whereas Google, it's almost the polar opposite. You know, you got to make 1,000 mistakes because we know on the 1,001st time that you do something, you're going to come up with something just absolutely world-changing, right? And you know, you need to recognize that you have those two competing needs. At the moment, with what's happening with big data, particularly around analytics, we need more possibilists. We need more of a view of innovation to be able to take advantage of this. And as you know, software and services and the general knowledge gets more commonplace, which is the same thing that happened with e-commerce in the 90s. You no longer needed somebody who had all this special skill to get you there. You know, we'll go back to a mode where operational excellency will become more important on the side of IT. But right now, you know, there's too much at risk, I think, from my perspective as a line of business manager, that you know, I would absolutely want to get out there and get my solutions in place and try to win market share immediately, rather than, you know, wait for something that might take a long time to get to. So,
Great. So we're coming down the home stretch here, and I'm going to get some final thoughts, and then we'll take some questions only. If you have questions at the end, we'll take a few questions, not comments. But Vince, what are we covered a lot of ground today. What are the top 3 things that you want people to leave? And I'm going to end every session with this from our speakers, and I'm going to send these back out. So what are the top 3 things that you would want people to leave with? Nice and pithy, 3 takeaways that you want from today.
Avoid dogma. Embrace data discovery as a way to understand the business value of all this data. I think that this notion of coming up with the business case for something that's never been done before is kind of a difficult bar to hurdle. So how do you do some discovery around that data to build intelligence into the decisions or the recommendations you're going to make? And I think the third thing would be invest in 2 things. Invest in an innovation agenda, and invest in your people, and not just the technologists, but the business people. So if you're educating technologists on new big data technologies, you also have to educate your business leadership on the implications of those things or the value of those things from a business perspective. So I would say those 3 things.
Boy, just 3 things. I think that that organizations should have a preference in this environment to drive action. Get out there, deploy, get solutions in place course correct if you made a mistake. But waiting is a greater mistake because, the market will pass you by. Competitors will get into the space and they'll win. So get out there, number one. Number two, try to find, in our case, it's Guy Harrison, a pretty smart guy. We have a lot of really bright people who work at within the Dell software organization. But having that sort of inner committee of knowledgeable experts who are respected by both sides is a huge advantage in this space. And then number three, again, we've talked a lot about this friction and this chasm that exists between the two organizations. And I would say that it is worth trying to find some common ground. That opening communication dialogues, trying to create center of excellence oriented approaches where you have constituencies from a variety of different groups together is a best practice and a good model. But at the end of the day, the number one thing is just drive action, get out there and start deploying solutions.
Great. Okay, we got time for a couple of questions if anybody has them. Yes.
So we talked a lot today about things that aren't working in terms of cultures and this divide between IT and the business, and some things that are working or have worked. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the catalysts that are moving organizations from not functioning to functioning? Are there specific groups in the organization that you're seeing are being successful in helping to drive those change initiatives, or is it a top-down or bottom-up? What are you guys seeing right now that's sort of making that transition?
And I'll answer mine while they're passing the mic. From my perspective, the companies that have done the most phenomenal work in this area they have found a way to have that alignment between, usually not a lot of people. I'm surprised at how few, actually. So you said the word committee, that scared me a little bit. Because I think if you get a core group of 2 to 5 people who really get it, business people and technologists, and when they get on the same page, wow. I don't care if it's a brand new company, like you're going to hear from some of them today, like Oyala and Netflix and that kind of thing. Could be older companies who are transforming themselves, but finding 2 or 3 champions and then let them do their stuff. Like when you let them go and do their stuff, amazing things happen. But it's normally not one, and I've never seen it be 10. So it's like a small group who really get it. That's when I see things take off.
So I see, that's a great question. I see a couple of catalysts. One are, it's not uncommon for me to go into meetings with senior executives in these companies, and they have a 3-year plan. And one of the things that stands out on the plan is cut $1 billion out of my IT budget. Now, when your data is doubling every 2 years and investment in IT has been going down, inversely, that's a pretty tall order. So when people get that kind of directive, then they're kind of forced to think outside the box, right? So that's a catalyst. Where another catalyst is where the business leadership sees that they're kind of stuck in a downward cycle of commoditization.
Excuse me, Vince. Can we get a DataStax person by the door so we don't get the slams and people are leaving? It's this realization that they're in this downward spiral of commoditization. So, interesting conversations that I have with people that make large diesel engines, for example, they've decided that I can't make engines as cheap as they can in Thailand or Vietnam or China or wherever. So they want to build services and community around their engines. It may sound crazy, but that's a way for them to differentiate, and that's a catalyst. And then from an IT perspective, we're starting to see a lot of implementations of large data warehouses, EDWs, starting to come end of life. So a lot of these things were deployed in 2002, 2003, 2005. They're coming end of life. And now people are looking at, there's got to be a better way to solve some of these problems. And that's another catalyst. And so when you have the technologists then that can go back and speak the language, hey, here's how I can save you this money on your bottom line, here's specifically how we're going to solve these business problems, and say it in a way that's not going to freak somebody out, like change how they balance checkbooks, then you can move forward. But those are probably the 3 catalysts that I see most often.
I don't know if I have three catalysts. You know,
One would be great.
one, you know, again, it boils down to, you know, clear and regular communication, you know, is really something that works well. I don't think the motivations are at odds. I think both IT and line of business want the same outcome. Neither group is like, I want to undermine this company, right? They both want to see positive results for the organization. They just have a different opinion of what's more important. They have a prioritization issue. And, you know, getting the communications out there so there's dialogue between the two groups, finding common ground, celebrating victories, that kind of thing is really important in times like these. So I would put it around that perspective.
Great. Do you guys have a few minutes to hang around outside?
Sure.
Okay, so they'll be outside for a few minutes if anybody wants to do follow-up. I'm going to be talking with Sean Knapp next from Uyala, the founder and CTO. Unbelievably smart guy. We're going to talk about can relational and NoSQL databases live together. I'm going to give you 5 minutes time to get to your next session. So thank you guys very much, and thanks to our guests. Appreciate it.